Welcome to Cash Chats with me, Andy Webb from BeCleverWithYourCash.com. This is the podcast to help you make the most of your money. Episode 221, I'll be sharing whether it's possible to be good with your money when it comes to banking and investments. So it turns out this week is Good Money Week. Yes, I know there's always a week for everything, isn't there? And most of the time it's, well, I don't know, Good Pie Week or something like that. But Good Money Week is obviously something I feel I can get behind. And this is all about how we can help find sustainable and ethical options for the places where we keep our money. So our current accounts, our savings accounts, our pensions and our investments. So to help me do this today, I am joined by Alex Crombie from Ethical Consumer. Now, if you're a long-term listener, you know I've had people in from Ethical Consumer before to talk about all sorts of things from fast fashion through to how to deal with Amazon. So they're the perfect people who are really well placed to find out what we should be doing with our cash. So in a moment, I'll be talking to Alex about all of those things. Before we do that, though, don't forget that there is a Cash Chats community over on Facebook. To get there, just head to BeCleverWithYourCash.com/community or just search for Cash Chats within Facebook itself. I'll accept you into the group if you apply. And it's a great place for you to just keep talking about topics from today's episode, from previous episodes, or just whatever the money matters are that you're having problems with at that time. And I'll help you out, or other people in the community will help out, or you can help out others who ask questions as well. It's a great place for us to keep talking, even when there isn't a new episode to listen to. And after my chat with Alex, do stay tuned because I'm going to quickly share my thoughts on how you can kind of balance up ethical current accounts, ethical savings accounts with some of the other kind of promotions and incentives that you might get elsewhere. Anyway, let's get into it. This is episode 221, Ethical Banking, Savings and Investments with my guest Alex Crombie from Ethical Consumer. Alex, thank you so much for joining me on Cash Chats to talk about our money in terms of ethics and where we should be putting it. I guess the first thing to talk about is when we talk about, I mean, I've had people from Ethical Consumer on the show before. We've talked about fast fashion. We've talked about Amazon. We've talked about these things which are, I guess, really tangible in lots of ways. You can see how your money is maybe making a difference. But why does it matter then where we keep our money rather than spend our money, where we keep our money? Why is this an important aspect to consider?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me, Andy. Glad to be on. And like you say, it's strange. I mean, when we talk about clothes or food, it's something people, you can hold it in your hands most of the time. You can easily understand some of the issues around it. People can understand how something's made, potential problems with that. But when it comes to money, money is quite an abstract concept in a way. It's quite detached from, we use it all the time, but actually what happens to it behind the scenes is not always very obvious, but it is very important. And actually, I mean, many people would argue that it's one of the most important things you can think about when it comes to ethical consumption, and we'll probably discuss that a little more later, I think. But essentially, we need to think about it because when you put your money in a bank or an investment fund or a pension, your money's getting used for something. It doesn't just sit there. You get interest on that money because someone is making a profit on it somewhere else. That's not an inherently bad thing, but the way it's done is the important bit. So, when you put your money in a savings account or current account, for example, that bank might then use the money to lend it to a company to expand their business or to start their business, might be lent to homeowners as a mortgage. There's many different things that it could be used for. It could be used to invest in government bonds. So that's the stuff we're interested in. What are the banks actually doing with your money when you've got it in there?
Because I think a lot of the time people think, well, they probably don't think about it, but in their head, there's a big vault under the bank, isn't there? With a big complicated wheel that you have to undo. And then all the cash is just sitting in there. But it doesn't do that. I mean, apart from the fact it's all digital now, they aren't just sitting on it. You're right. It's actually being used for something. And this was something that only a couple of years ago now that really kind of sort of was this kind of, that moment where you're like, that kind of awakening, like, oh my God, of course this is happening. Of course this is going on. And of course, a lot of the time, this money is going to places which, if you are actively trying to do those things, which adhere to your principles and your own, ethics, you kind of, I want to make a difference. I want to do this. I want to do that. This could be actively going counter to some of that stuff. I mean, what are some of the are kind of the places that people might be surprised. They probably shouldn't be surprised, but might be surprised that the money is actually being used for?
I mean, in a way, everything, there's anything, anything that is part of the economy is funded or has been funded in some way, and that most of the time has come from a bank. So, for example, fossil fuel expansion, going and drilling in new places to find oil, or funding new coal plants. But it's also things such as funding nuclear weapons, funding all sorts of weapons, really. I mean, another thing is tobacco, gambling, pornography, literally anything that someone somewhere in some financial institution, whether it be bank or otherwise, there's going to be money sitting behind that economic activity. I watched a really good TED talk. I don't know if I think most people are familiar with TED. It's someone giving a talk about all different sorts of topics, and this was someone talking about pensions, and they were a scientist involved in cancer research, and so they'd spent all their life kind of looking at how to cure cancer, and then they realized, getting to near retirement age, I think, and actually saw what their pension money was invested in, and it's invested in tobacco companies. Some of the biggest holdings of their pension were in tobacco, and they thought, well, I'm trying to solve this problem during my work, and then the whole time my money that I'm generating from that work is actually supporting companies that are one of the biggest causes of cancer. So like you said, a lot of the time it can kind of contradict things we might be trying to do elsewhere, but lots of people aren't aware of it, because like we said, money kind of and the world of banking sits a little bit behind the view of most people, and understandably so. So you could be maybe you're vegetarian, or you're vegan, or you're just trying to cut down on your meat for whatever reason, but chances are, if you're just in a standard pension or bank, your money is somewhere being invested in, I don't know, some big industrial farming or livestock rearing in Brazil that's cutting down the rainforest, this sort of thing. Yeah.
And if there was, imagine like an ethical consumer hierarchy, so to speak, of your actions and results, where does this sit from? Like personally, I'm boycotting Amazon for the year, and I've boycotted Nestle, for example, and I do my recycling every single fortnight and recycle a huge amount, to the extent that our bin men complain about how much we're recycling. But these are things that I can do. But I mean, in comparison, on that scale, where do they sit compared to the move? Making sure your money is in a different place.
I mean, it's difficult to say. Is a very non-committal answer. I think it is one of the most important things. So we actually do say, put it near the top of that hierarchy. But measuring impact with stuff like this is very, very difficult. You might choose to go and bank with a better bank, and that might be alongside loads of other people, and that might cause a slight change in policy of some of the banks that have less ethical policies. But it's very difficult to actually measure that. But we know it does have effect, because companies and banks listen to their customers. Ultimately, they want customers, because that's how they make money. Also, it's important, I think, to point out that even if you just have a few savings, most people across the UK don't have a huge amount of savings, actually. Probably the biggest one for most people is their pension. But even if you've got, let's just say, a couple of £1,000 in your savings account, banks are allowed to actually lend out, I think, about 9 times more on average than is in your account. So, wow. £1,000 becomes £9,000 that they can lend elsewhere. So it's not actually just the money that you've given them, that is sort of amplified as well when they lend it. So in that sense, it is a very important thing where you put your money.
Absolutely. And it's kind of, so not just that direct investment as well, there's all sorts of things you can take from it sort of subsequently as well, like the carbon footprint of some of your investments and your savings and stuff could really sort of, again, like I've seen some stats which are kind of this massive figures that are created by, potentially a normal pension fund. And you're already trying to say, look, in a normal time, I want to fly less to reduce my carbon footprint, but your pension's doing X, Y, and Z. So it's a really sort of massive, a massive step to people can take, I think, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and I think I've seen that same stat that you're talking about around the pensions. It's been flying around a bit recently. I think the most recent organization that's using a big stat like this is Make Your Money Matter, which are a really fantastic organization who are campaigning, trying to get people to move their pension into a more ethical pension pot. And a lot of their campaign is around environment and cutting carbon. And they did this study and found that, I think they said, you can cut your carbon impact 20 times more by moving your pension to a sustainable fund when you compare that to stopping flying, going veggie, and changing your energy supplier. And I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical of some of these stats. Not that I don't think there's big impact. I think that when you put really specific figures on it like this, it can be, I think it can be a little bit misleading. And also, I think there's a danger that people think, well, you know what, I've changed my pension to an ethical one now. So actually, I'm going to go on 7 holidays this year. Doesn't matter about the flights because I've changed my pension. So, you know, and you own, essentially, when your money in your pension, if it's invested in shares in a company, you're a part owner of that company. Now, that's a bit different to actually demanding the product that the company produces, right? If I own, if my money is invested in a producer of meat, I might have shares in that, so technically own a little bit of that company, but I'm not actually demanding the products that it's producing. So it's a bit of a big argument, this. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but to kind of summarize, I think there's big impact, very big impact from moving your finances. I'm just a little bit wary of some of these figures that put exact stats and say it's much better than doing all these things. We want to encourage people to make all the changes that they can, really.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's assume you're listening still, because if you don't care about these things, you probably tuned out already. But I hope everyone's still kind of right. I've got some things that are important to me. I want to make a difference. I'm doing X, Y, and Z. How do I do that same thing? How do I make my the places where my money is sitting adhere to those principles and have the biggest impact? So should we start with like everyday banking, your current and your savings accounts? How do we look for an account that is ethical? How do we find the good from the bad?
Well, I mean, I think on the face of it, when you're looking to open an account, it's not so much that you can just see, you know, this current account looks ethical, or they don't really. Often you're told what the interest rate is, or there's a bit of stuff around, you know, the kind of boring technicalities, but you rarely see the kind of ethical policies you know, when you're looking at a current account. So we want to look at the bank as a whole, really, because that's where the bank will have policies. You know, I'd encourage people mainly to look at our website or to subscribe to our magazine. Just, I've got to plug us at some point, don't I? But you know, so that's what we do. We go and look kind of at the real details of the policies that these banks have, and we tell you, you know, which are the good ones and which are the bad ones, which are using your money for financing fossil fuels or financing arms, and which are using your money to finance green energy, for example. So what you want, I mean, there's lots of different policies they can have, but if we take an example, I mean, Triodos Bank is a bank that we kind of rate the highest. They consistently come out at the top of our rankings, and they're really, in some ways, a bit of a kind of activist bank, if you like. They're very different, I think, certainly from all the big major banks in the UK. And if I'll give you a couple of examples of policies they might have. So they say they've got their positive approach identifies sustainable sectors that they want to invest in, for example, organic food production. And then it also excludes a lot of things that it won't invest in. You know, this is the more common way that banks will give you policies around what they're not doing, right? So Triodos excludes investing in companies that produce or sell weapons. It also excludes companies that operate in industries that are identified as high risk for violation of human rights. If if companies don't have a good policy around that. Also doesn't invest in companies that test cosmetics on animals, test non-medical products on animals. So, there's loads of things. They've got, if people want to look them up, you can look up the Triodos minimum standards. It's available online, and you'll see a big list of things they don't do and things that they do. So that's the main way that we kind of judge them, really.
And I think they're really good in terms of, you cannot in terms of those kind of standards you've got. It's there. It's very published. It's very public in what they're doing. It's not hidden away anywhere. It's all very, very obvious to find. So if you are worried about these things, then that is absolutely, I agree with you that the top current accounts go for. The problem some people might have with it is a £3 fee every single month. Now, you might argue for 36 quid a year to actually do all that, potentially your money to be doing good in return, is a small amount to pay. And I've certainly, since I opened my account a while ago, I don't use it as my main account, but I've got an account, and I'm kind of happy to pay that money for that stuff to be going on. But that still might be quite a jump for some people. So I guess then it's kind of that next level down. And is there still a series of, we look at building societies, for example, can be potentially, are they a good place to sort of broadly look in a kind of, they're going to be better than some of the others?
Yeah, and it's a good point. Triodos do charge for their current account, which is quite an unusual thing in the banking sector. And they have their justification for doing it, which you've kind of explained. But for some people, and we do have a big problem in this country with lots of people on very low incomes. So I can totally understand. Some people might not feel like that's an extra expense that they can manage. So building societies are also a really good bet. They're kind of based on different principles in a way. They are owned by their members generally, and the money is primarily used for mortgages almost exclusively. So if you put your money in a building society, such as Nationwide is the biggest, but there's quite a few others actually. Although I'm not sure how many offer current accounts, but Nationwide definitely do. So there your money is almost certainly going to end up being used as a mortgage for another of Nationwide's members. And I think that's quite an important point, that building societies don't have to answer to shareholders in the same way that big banks do. And actually, I think this is a problem that is not just with the big banks, but big companies too. I think when companies have to answer to shareholders, essentially profit becomes the main thing that they're having to answer for. And so ethics gets pushed down the line. So I think that's an important distinction to make between building societies and traditional banks.
Absolutely. And is there an element of within the building societies that you can, I guess, essentially look for sort of more positive approach as well? There's an aspect that because they're a building society, they can't do any of those things. They can't go and invest necessarily in a nuclear arms or power plant or fracking or whatever it might be, just because of the nature of building society. But some, I guess, will also have some more sort of forward-thinking approaches as well. So you can, essentially, if you want to, pick ones which adhere even stronger to your principles if you wish.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, kind of going back to my point before, if one of the main things we want companies and banks to do is, be transparent about what they're doing. Tell us what you're doing, because if you're not telling us, you're probably doing something bad. is the general principle, which I think usually applies. So if you're looking at a company's website and you can't see, they don't seem to have a list of things they exclude, that's probably a bad sign, because it probably means they're just investing in anything. Sometimes these policies can be a little bit hidden, so you might have to have a good look, but that's what we're doing all the time, which is why I recommend people use our website as a bit of a kind of shortcut. But if you're wanting to do your own research, if you're not finding much and you've had a good dig, then that's a bit of a worrying sign. The companies that are doing good stuff will, be very transparent about it. And just another point about, we also recommend for current accounts, the Co-op Bank, which is quite an interesting example, because the Co-op Bank has kind of long been, it used to be a very radical bank, actually. There's, you watch some of its old adverts and they are really quite radical. And in 2013, it got, you know, it kind of got bought out by a bunch of hedge funds because it was, you know, it was in trouble. So it is currently owned by several different hedge funds. That is a bit of an issue, but it still has strong ethical policies. So we still think it is an ethical bank largely. And if you're interested, or you're already a customer of the Co-op Bank, you should have a look at. We started a campaign along with some other of the Co-op Bank's members called Save Our Bank, or the Customer Union for Ethical Banking, which is essentially a campaign to try and stop the Co-op Bank from watering down any of its ethical policies. And this campaign was started after it was bought out. So if you're interested in becoming a member of that, if you're with the Co-op Bank, then look us up, and for a small fee, you can support that campaign.
It's really, as you say, like, you know, I'm a ethical consumer subscriber, and have been for a long time. But those extra sort of bits of information can be really insightful. Stuff you would never consider sometimes crops up. And when we talk about some of the newer digital banks, Monzo and Starling, for example, they talk the talk in lots of ways and say we are quite ethical and we follow these principles. We're anti this, we're anti that. Starling seems to be sort of a little bit better than Monzo in this. But when you sort of then dig down a little bit, you find that Monzo, for example, one of its major kind of like shareholders, venture capitalist owners, is linked to the Trump campaign. And that might be something you have issues with. And Starling Bank recently took a large chunk of private investment from the Qatari government. And again, if you're worried about human rights abuses around the world, then Qatar is somewhere that you possibly wouldn't necessarily want to get your money going towards. Yet that's sometimes happening further down the line. So it isn't always a simple answer. And I guess you say not always a kind of a perfect solution.
Yeah, exactly. And those are interesting examples, I think, those kind of challenger app-based banks, because, you know, they've come along and they've shaken up the system a bit. Like, you know, Starling has grown massively since it's, so has Monzo. And, you know, they didn't score that badly when we looked at them, but that's almost because they were too small to be doing anything bad. You know, some of these other banks have been around for years and years and are huge institutions, and so kind of have, you know, are up to all sorts, really. Whereas these newer banks are kind of, you know, they haven't done, I don't think they're financing fossil fuels or big, you know, arms companies, but they are also not, you know, they're not as explicitly ethical as Triodos, for example. And it'll be interesting to see what happens now that, for example, Starling's part owned by, you know, the Qatar authority. I can't remember the full name of it, but, you know, because sometimes this, and, you know, there's a bit of debate around this between people. People have different views on it. How much does it matter if this company that might be good is owned by someone, you know, questionable? Well, if its policies are still good and it's actually not doing anything bad, for some people that's not as much of a problem. And I don't know, I think over time, though, quite often, if, you know, a smaller company, ethical company is bought out by a bigger one, quite often, you know, the smaller ethical companies' policies will get watered down a bit. I think that's the danger. But I guess we'll have to, we'll see what happens with the app-based ones.
Definitely. So that, I mean, that feels like current accounts covered quite well. Savings accounts, I guess, there's a slight sort of a larger disconnect there for consumers, because you want to kind of get as better interest rate as you possibly can, particularly because they're so poor right now and inflation even getting higher and higher. You kind of want to get the best you possibly can, and that might make people think, well, it doesn't matter, so to speak. I want to get the best return. I'll go for X over Y. But I mean, I wonder actually, you know, building societies, actually, we already discussed they're decent places for your money, and they can have some of the, you know, very attractive, if not the best, you know, not too far behind some of the leading rates. They're worth looking at. But when I do my kind of regular updates of the best savings accounts, something that pops up quite a lot are Sharia accounts. So how do they sort of fit in that kind of ethical world?
So, you know, I'll start with saying I'm not an expert in Islamic finance at all. So, you know, I apologize to anyone who is if I get this wrong. But essentially, the way I understand them is that, you know, there's certain Islamic principles which make up Sharia law, such as, I think you're not allowed to charge interest. So, you know, so there's kind of ways of getting around that as far as I understand, but it means the setup is a little bit different, because you can't charge interest on loaning money. I also think, Sharia accounts won't be investing in things that break other Islamic principles, such as, maybe investing in an alcohol production company, or companies that are producing pork, for example, because these are haram and they're against Islamic law. So in the same way that we talked about, banks will have or should have exclusions, things they're not investing in, gambling, arms, that sort of thing. Sharia accounts will have exclusions based on Islamic law, and that's kind of my understanding. But like I say, I'm not an expert.
I think it's one of those things that it will have. It potentially they can be some. Let's say it could be, alcohol could be an issue for you, so your money's going to be safe there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't also be investing in fossil fuels. That money could still be going that way. It just depends on how it links into Islam. So it might be a kind of there might be some ethical principles behind it, but you have to check, I suppose, that it fits in with the things you're particularly after. And that sometimes can be the harder thing to find out, as exactly where the money's going, which is why I guess that transparency you get with some of them is better than others. And before we move on to investing in pensions, is it worth it just talk about who to avoid? And I mean, I guess it's kind of almost obvious because we haven't mentioned them so far, but who are the worst offenders when it comes to some of those big ethical issues and your money?
Well, I think, as a general rule, the big high street banks, most of them are pretty unethical in lots of ways. But, if I was to single out a couple, Barclays is, historically and still is a terrible bank for its ethics. HSBC as well. If we're talking about fossil fuel financing, HSBC and Barclays are two of the biggest fossil fuel finances in the world. That's both kind of fossil fuel projects that are already there, but also, new explorations and expansion of fossil fuels, which we should not be doing anymore. So those two, but Barclays as well, it's a huge investor in weapons. One of the things that really irks me is, it happens all over the place, but greenwashing or whitewashing of ethical policies. And I keep seeing, when it was LGBT Pride, I kept seeing these Barclays adverts saying we are supporters of Pride, and I just had a little look on their website now saying, they had little things explaining why they're supporting it and about microaggressions, these sort of things. Great, it's obviously fantastic to support LGBT rights, but when you're a bank that is also financing big arms companies that are selling arms, they've got they're a big funder of BAE Systems, which sells arms to the Saudi Arabian government, hardly a big promoter of LGBT rights, and and has been engaged in the war in Yemen for years and years. So that sort of greenwashing or whitewashing really is, really makes me mad.
I'd imagine. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of those. It's you you see this one side of things, and it's not the full picture, isn't it? It's like, here you might find some certain providers might offer, and we'll probably get onto this a bit more when we talk about investing in pensions. But here's a particularly ethical account over here. You can take this, and this one in particular will do X, Y, and Z, which is great compared to their other options. But it's still essentially in that big machine, which as an organisation they're kind of not really. It's just a kind of a little bit of, they say that greenwashing here. Look, we're doing these great things over here, but it's only 0.01% of all their actual activities which counter that. And I guess one thing that's it's worth mentioning as well, and I've spoken about this a lot on the blog, is that JP Morgan Chase have just launched a UK current account as well, massive American bank, and they are so big that they are likely as well to, I imagine, be one of the in the mix there, I would say, in terms of the bad boys, in terms of the banking world.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I don't know a huge amount about JP Morgan Chase off the top of my head, but certainly, yeah, they're one of the biggest banking institutions, and will almost, I'm sure they're a big funder of fossil fuels as well, and arms. So yeah, I think as a general advice, avoid the kind of big major banks, and have a look at some of the ones we recommended and the ones we've discussed here, such as Triodos or Building Societies or the Co-op Bank. But in terms of savings as well, I'll just say there were a couple others that I think we recommended. Ecology, which is kind of supports community-led affordable housing. They do a savings account, and Charity Bank as well, which is owned by charities and is kind of dedicated to supporting them. So there's some other options as well.
Yeah, and Ecology Building Society actually has a pretty decent regular saver at the moment, 0.8%, which is only a little bit under the 1%. I mean, yeah, 1% isn't fantastic, but that's the best you're going to get in most regular savers. So is it worth taking a bit of a cut and putting your money with them than with, NatWest or Lloyds or whoever it might be? Let's move on to investing in pensions now, because you mentioned at the top just how, the amount of money you have in savings might not be a huge amount. You said £1,000. Some people might not even have a few £100, but just their money in their accounts is X amount. Over time, the money they have invested in their pensions, and potentially if they're investing as well, can be so much larger. So in theory, that's going to have a much, much larger impact on the issues we've discussed so far. I wonder how much with ethical investings and ethical pensions, how much people worry about the performance. So I know you can't say that past performance is an indicator of how something is going to, make money for you or how much it's going to perform in the future. But actually, are ethical funds that different to normal investments?
Well, I mean, I think there's been this belief or kind of fear, especially among people who work in the sector, that essentially what they want to do is just provide the best rate of interest, or expand your savings, your pension as much as possible in the time span, and have a mix of different investments. You want it. They would see it's safer if you invested in a little bit of everything, a little bit of each sector. So the idea of excluding sectors, which an ethical pension would do, I think to a lot of people kind of scared them. But actually, there was a study in 2019 by Morningstar, which is kind of it operates a website about finances and investment funds and stuff, and they analysed just under 5,000 investment funds, and found that just under 60% of the sustainable funds performed much better than average traditional funds. And actually, especially over the pandemic, the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen the ethical funds do quite well. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, partly they're generally quite invested in tech and healthcare, which are two things that have, been very necessary during the pandemic. But also they, if it is an ethical fund, it shouldn't be invested at all, or not very heavily, in fossil fuels. So obviously, we've seen kind of, during the pandemic, there was dips in the prices of oil, so that didn't really affect those funds as much. So for many people, I think actually it's not just looking like a good choice ethically, but also in terms of making money and expanding your pension pot or investment.
So how would you go about finding these? I mean, they talk about, this is a term that I hear people talk about, is ESG quite a lot. And for most people, what does that even mean? But it's, environmental, social, and governance. They're the kind of three principles that you'd be looking at there. But is that all you need to do, or is it actually, do you need to take a little bit more time to find the right funds from the right providers?
Yeah. So ESG seems to be this term which is, they love using it in finance, and you don't really see it as much in other sectors. It's kind of, it's everywhere. When you're reading through their kind of sustainability reports, almost to the point of becoming meaningless, I think sometimes, but not to be too skeptical. But again, it's difficult, and there's a lot of detail, especially with pensions. And I think people are quite nervous. Your pension pot for most people is your biggest savings, and it's what you need when you retire. You don't want to take too many risks, or what you see as risk. And for a lot of people, it's a difficult area to understand. So again, I'd say refer to our website. We've got a lot of information on there, and some pensions we recommend. But there's a few, the issues are similar to what we talked about before. What is your money going towards? Now, as I said previously, we really want pensions and investment funds to be transparent. So if you're with a good pension fund that is transparent, you should be able to go on and have a look. Usually they'll show you the top 10 holdings, what companies is your money actually invested in. But the ones who are really transparent will show you the whole list. You can see every company or government bond or whatever it is that your money is invested in. So we encourage you to go and have a look for that, see where your money is. And I guess it's important at this point to say there's different way of doing pensions too. You've got your workplace pension, which many people are enrolled with. There's Nest, which is the government. Not sure if I can say it's government owned or, it's it was set up by the government, which actually we performed very well when we looked at it and had some very good policies around climate change and divesting from fossil fuels. But you can also do your pension a bit more, kind of DIY and choose your own funds. And that's a case usually of, you might have your pension provider, might be one company, for example, Aviva, and Aviva might offer their own package, but they might also allow you to choose your own funds. And that's where you can use our guide to ethical investment funds kind of in combination and see which ones are actually, which are very ethical and not just ethical or sustainable in name.
Because you can do different things as well. There's different ways of doing it. There's that sense of avoid, isn't there? First of all, it's like my money is not going towards this thing that I don't want it to go towards, so arms or climate change kind of contributors. It doesn't not go to that. And I guess the next level from that is the kind of the proactive ones. It's similar in how we talked about current accounts with Triodos, isn't there? And so you can then invest either in funds, which is like a group of different investments, so different firms who are doing things. It could be investing loads of money in, wind power, or potentially, couldn't you, or something like that, where they're trying to sort of really focus on an area. You could, as you say, go for an individual company if you want to, and maybe the best thing to do is get a mix of those things, so you're kind of like hedging your bets, not having everything in one pot. But there's one other thing I want to talk about before we do go, though, is this idea of activist investment and activist shareholding, where people are kind of actively kind of like trying to get a large number of people to put money into. It could be Apple, it could be Shell. Do you know what I mean? These companies who you might potentially have some issues with, to try and then force change in the long run. And this is only something I've kind of come across sort of more recently, and I think it's really interesting. But can this work? Can this be a good thing?
I mean, it's kind of been, it's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one to measure. I think I've come to the conclusion that generally it doesn't work. For example, I think you get investment funds that say, yeah, we do invest in, for example, Shell, like you say, but we make sure we always, we use that investment for good, and we vote at their annual general meetings to ensure that they're becoming better. But actually, I don't think a lot of the time it has pushed much change. If you're a minority shareholder as well, which, more of the kind of activist funds are, you don't have a lot of say at those meetings. You'll almost certainly be, compared to the majority of shareholders who most of the time actually just want to maximize their money, maximize their returns. So I don't think it is that effective. That said, there's some groups that I think use it interestingly. For example, BankTrack is a really interesting organization who do a lot of work focused on the finance sector, similar to what we do really, but they are just focused on finance. And they recently went to the Barclays AGM, which I assume that means they have some shares in Barclays, to raise questions about Barclays fossil fuel policy and expansion, but also its funding of businesses or the banks in Israel and the apartheid state there. And so they use these questions to bring the issues up, and they widely publicize that they've done this, to try and cause a bit of a, bit of a problem for Barclays. So that's an interesting way of doing it. I think when funds or businesses say, yeah, we do engage with them, but they don't really do that much in terms of actual engagement. That's what I'm more skeptical of. So I think there is a place for it in the way that BankTrack does it, but I think what's probably best is if companies actively divest from those unethical companies and put their money towards more ethical ones. Yeah.
And I guess you've got that power yourself to kind of try and encourage, something like your workplace pension, you might not be able to actively choose a more ethical fund, but you can absolutely push your employer to potentially change who they are using as the pension provider, or if not, then contact Aviva or whoever it might be and say, as one of your customers, I want this. That's all going to hopefully make some kind of impact. They see this kind of desire is out there that could force them to move away from some of those less ethical organizations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good point that, when we have to think about what we can do and where we can put our money. But if you're able to do that at an organizational level for your work, convince your workplace to move from one default pension to another, a more ethical one, that's a much bigger change. And so if you can do that, that's a really, really great thing to be able to do. We've got some information on our website, which can help people do that. Make My Money Matter as well, like I mentioned before, has good advice on how to change your pension, and you're convinced. I think they're running a campaign at the moment to convince your company or your workplace to move their pensions to somewhere more ethical. And Share Action as well are another organisation who do good work around this. So I'd recommend having a look at all those, really.
Brilliant. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to find more about Ethical Consumer, if they maybe want to sign up and subscribe, what are the best places for them to go?
So our website is the best place, which is just ethicalconsumer.org. And we produce a print magazine, I should say, which comes out every 2 months, which you can subscribe to. And when you subscribe, you also get access to the website, which has all the previous issues, but also, like I say, if you want to look about pensions, you can search the section on pensions on there, and that advice is updated very frequently. And, we're an independent organisation, we're a cooperative, and a not-for-profit. So actually we're funded by our subscriptions. So that's a good thing to do with your money too, is fund us.
Fantastic, mate. Thank you so much.
All right. No, thank you so much, Andy. Cheers.
So hopefully there's some stuff for you to think about there. I appreciate it's not always going to be the easiest thing to kind of get this done. You might have to take a little bit more sort of proactive actions yourself to kind of get your money in the best places, particularly when it comes down to your pension. That might take a bit more work, and some of the things might be a little bit easier to do, like moving your savings or moving your current accounts. But that in turn might mean you do miss out on some of the things that I talk about regularly here on the podcast or on the YouTube channel or over in the blog, some of those incentives and offers that you can get from current accounts, or the highest interest rate you can get from savings. Now, with savings, I think that, as I mentioned in my chat with Alex there, the rates are so relatively poor right now that you're not going to be missing out too much by choosing an ethical savings account instead of the highest paying account, if in fact the highest paying one isn't an ethical one. There are options out there that you can look at, particularly when we talk about the building societies. When you look at regular savers, you're going to be getting a decent rate, well, a comparable rate to the other ones from the likes of Coventry Building Society. That gives 1.05% on a regular saver right now. Nationwide has a 1% one, although admittedly it is on only £100 every month you can put aside. They're decent options, and you are going to be getting close to, if not better than, what other most regular savers are going to offer. When you look at easy access accounts, it's not quite as good, but again, Nationwide does have an account there which, although it's a limited access one, it will give you again a rate that's not too far off the top ones. Tandem was the leading one at 0.65%. That had a green instant access account. Again, I don't know how ethical it is an organisation, but an ethical account there is available. That rate has dropped. It's not the best one right now, but again, you're looking at such small amounts less in terms of that percentage, that the interest you earn isn't going to be life-changing. Now, admittedly, if interest rates were to increase and suddenly you saw big differences, then you might have to kind of decide for yourself how much money you're willing to put into the ethical side of your money, making sure that your money, when it is in that savings account, isn't going towards any of those things Alex and I discussed. Now, with current accounts, it's not quite as simple because, the best one, as we mentioned there, Triodos, you do have to pay for it, although technically you could say someone somewhere is paying for your current account even if you aren't doing that right now. And often that's through overdraft charges that the people who are less well off or less well in terms of skilled at balancing their money and managing their accounts, they're paying for your account through the fees elsewhere. So the fairer way to do it would be for you to pay for something like Triodos. Triodos, though, I have got a whole review of that over on the blog and on the YouTube channel. I really like what they do, but if you're used to something like Starling or Monzo, then it's not going to have the features that you might want. In fact, one of the problems I have with Nationwide, as much as I love it as a building society and some of the things it does, and indeed that ethical approach as well, the app isn't great either. So then maybe you do want to be looking at the likes of Starling, which, although we talked there about that investment from the Qataris, which does kind of sour it slightly for me, it's still, because it isn't doing bad and it does have some proactive policies, is indeed probably a better option for you to go for if you want to make sure you have that functionality of an app which does all the kind of fancy things that new sort of digital banks do, and not being with the likes of Barclays or HSBC or NatWest or all those kind of companies that we spoke about before that maybe should be avoided. Now, but how does that then connect with all those special offers that I've talked about on a regular basis? So again, let's look at Barclays. You can get £36 a year, which isn't a huge amount of money, but £3 every month through the Blue Reward scheme. There's even an offer if you are potentially like a really high earner to maybe get a huge number of Avios points for switching into their Premier banking account. Now, they are kind of, as Alex said, perhaps one of the worst ones, but really they're all much of muchness if you want to avoid Halifax with its £5, Lloyds with its cinema tickets. I still think you can take advantage of those offers and get that cash from those banks if you want to. I'm still happy doing that because if that money comes to me, I can then potentially use that to justify the £3 a month that I spend on Triodos. The thing here is to make sure that you don't keep much money in there and really just take advantage of them if you can, rather than use them for your everyday banking. If you're worried about this stuff, and if you're still listening now, I'm sure you probably are. Instead, make sure that money is funneling through, again, Triodos, Nationwide, Starling, someone like that, where the money isn't going to be lent out to those organisations. So by all means, have those accounts, take advantage of those offers, but don't leave large sums of cash sitting in there, which they can then lend out. Although, of course, if you really want to go fully on this, really commit to it, then avoid those banks completely. Even the free money from like the switching offers and stuff, you obviously want to avoid getting that. So that's it for this week. I'm hoping there'll be another episode. The Your Money This Week roundup of the week's news should be back this Friday. Fingers crossed everything goes to plan. If not, I will see you again next Tuesday. But in the meantime, my name is Andy Webb. You have been listening to Cash Chats. Until next time, cheers.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do leave me a review. Let me know what you think, and why not tell a friend as well. Remember, any information shared in this episode should not be seen as financial advice. If you need more information, you should do your own research. And finally, the music is Easter Island by Lonely Punk and provided on a Creative Commons license.